Alright, AP World History Scholars. Let's dive into one of the biggest stories of the 20th century. The spread of communism after 1900. This is your crash course for Unit 8. Topic 4. So grab your notes and let's get started. So, how did this idea, born in the mind of Karl Marx in the 19th century, explode across the globe in the 20th? It wasn't just a random event. The world was dealing with massive problems: economic instability, colonial empires that were starting to crack, and widespread social inequality. For many people, communism seemed like the answer. It promised a society without classes, where wealth was shared and the workers, not the rich elites, held the power. Let's start with Russia. The Russian Revolution of 1917 is a game-changer. The country was in turmoil. World War I was a disaster. The Tsar was an ineffective ruler, and people were literally starving in the streets. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party saw their chance. They seized power, promising peace, land, and bread. They established the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. This wasn't a peaceful transition. It was followed by a brutal civil war. But ultimately, the communists won, and their model became a powerful example for others around the world. Now, let's travel east to China. For decades, China had faced internal division and foreign interference. After a long and bloody civil war, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, came to power in 1949. Mao's version of communism was a bit different from the Soviet model. He saw the peasants, not the urban factory workers, as the driving force of the revolution. This adaptation was key. It showed that communism could be tailored to different societies, especially agricultural ones. Mao's government immediately began to collectivize agriculture and took control of all industries, completely reshaping Chinese society. But the story doesn't stop there. The appeal of communism was global. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh led a nationalist movement that blended communism with a fierce desire for independence from French colonial rule. His victory inspired anti-colonial movements everywhere. Similarly, in Cuba, Fidel Castro led a revolution against a corrupt US-backed dictator. While his revolution wasn't initially communist, he later aligned with the Soviet Union, bringing the Cold War right to America's doorstep. Other countries also saw communist movements gain traction. In places like Angola and Nicaragua, communist ideas fueled revolutions and civil wars, often becoming battlegrounds for the larger Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, what were the consequences of these communist revolutions? On one hand, some states saw improvements in literacy and women's rights. The idea of gender equality was a core part of communist ideology, even if the reality was often more complex. For example, in the Soviet Union and China, women were encouraged to join the workforce and were granted more legal rights than they had under the old regimes. However, there's a much darker side to this story. These revolutions often led to widespread repression and violence. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's policies resulted in the deaths of millions through political purges, forced labor in the gulags, and devastating famines caused by forced collectivization in China. Mao's Great Leap Forward was a disastrous attempt to rapidly industrialize the country, leading to one of the worst famines in human history. Similarly, in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, implemented a radical and brutal form of communism that resulted in a genocide, killing roughly a quarter of the country's population. Another major consequence was land reform, a central promise of many communist movements. In places like Russia, China, and Vietnam, large estates owned by the aristocracy were seized and redistributed to peasants. Initially, this was incredibly popular, but this policy often evolved into forced collectivization, where the state took control of all the land and forced peasants to work on large state-run farms. This often led to a drop in agricultural productivity and, as we saw, could lead to catastrophic famines. The spread of communism also defined the Cold War. The world became polarized into two camps: the capitalist bloc, led by the United States, and the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union. This ideological conflict never resulted in direct war between the two superpowers, but it fueled proxy wars all over the globe, from Korea and Vietnam to Afghanistan and Angola. The US adopted a policy of containment, trying to stop the spread of communism wherever it could, which shaped global politics for nearly half a century. So, to wrap it all up for your AP exam, what are the key takeaways? First, remember the context. Communism didn't spread in a vacuum. It was a response to real-world problems like inequality and imperialism. Second, know your key examples: the Russian Revolution creating the Soviet model, and Mao adapting it for China's peasant population. Third, understand the consequences, both the promised benefits like social equality and the horrific realities of authoritarian control, violence and economic failure. and finally connect it all to the Cold War. The spread of communism was the engine that drove this global ideological struggle. Keep these points in mind and you'll be in great shape for this topic on the exam. Thanks for watching and be sure to subscribe for more AP World History reviews. Keep studying.